Our next speaker today is Mr. Randy Russell. Randy will come up and join me. He leads the Russell Group, a Washington, D.C. based agriculture and government affairs consulting firm that works on issues involving child nutrition, food safety, something very important to me, ag research, biofuels, animal health, trade, conservation, agriculture production, rural water, infrastructure, and biotechnology. You got your hands full, right? He does. Randy attended George Mason University, where he studied public administration and did his graduate work in economics. He's worked exclusively in agriculture issues as Chief of Staff to Secretary of Agriculture, John Block. He also, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Economics, he also served as an agriculture aide for Capitol Hill for the Senate Agriculture Committee and former U.S. Senator Ruby Boswitz. I will tell you, Randy comes highly recommended from Ray Stark. And Ray actually said to the commissioner that if you can get this guy here, you're going to hit a home run. Is that right, Commissioner? Well, you know, you don't have to be around Randy long. And we got to talk a little bit this morning to really see his enthusiasm for what he does, the energy that he brings forward, the knowledge and the wealth of history that he brings in working there with Ronald Reagan and others. So help me, if you will, welcome Randy Russell this morning. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that very, very kind and generous, I might say, introduction. Commissioner, thank you for having me. I know you're under the weather. I've been battling that myself a little bit. I want to tell everybody what a great pleasure it is for me to be here in Raleigh, to be at this conference. I also want to tell you that as I took off this morning on a 6:20 flight to fly here, we took off over the Potomac, and while the swamp has not been drained, the water level is down. So I think the Trump effect is coming into play. I just want to start off, first of all, by acknowledging a few people. You know, the commissioner here has done an outstanding job. You know, when I talk to people around the country and go to conferences around the country, and North Carolina's Department of Agriculture is viewed as being one of the very best across the country, and that's because of the commissioner and the fine staff that he has here. So you do a great job, and congratulations to you. Also, it's great to see Rob. I hadn't seen Rob Hosford in a while. He was a former colleague in Washington, D.C. when he was at Farm Services Agency at NCBA, so it's great to see him. You guys here are also, I think, very blessed by having a wonderful congressional delegation. You know, we all like to think we want people just on the Ag Committee, and trust me, that's very important, but we also have members from North Carolina that are on other committees that are critically important to the agriculture and food industry in North Carolina. You know, you got Senator Tillis, who is, I know, going to do a video for you here, I think a little bit later today, was on the Ag Committee. He was absolutely instrumental in helping us get the Biotech Disclosure Act. So is G.K. Butterfield, who's a member, a Democratic member that is on the House Energy and Commerce Committee. We would not have gotten that bill passed without his leadership. You got Senator Burr, who's on the Health Committee that oversees FDA and has done a great job on food safety and on tobacco legislation. My good friend and many of yours, David Rouser, who I met when he was with Elizabeth Dole as a staffer, and I can think of no one that had more of an impact on the tobacco buyout of the early 2000s that Blake referred to than David Rouser, and he's now a subcommittee chairman of House Ag. And then finally, Richard Hudson, who is a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee that has oversight of FDA. He's a rising star in the Republican caucus of the House. It was mentioned a little bit about Ray Starling. You know, I think all of us are blessed to have in the White House an ag advisor to the president that has the background, the personality, and the expertise of Ray Starling. He has done a terrific job for President Trump and the Trump administration. He very proudly, when you meet with him, talks about his experiences growing up in a hog and tobacco farm in North Carolina. And I want you to know he's one of the very finest advisors to the president on agriculture that we've had since that position was created back in the 80s. Let me today just take a couple of minutes and give you a little political overview and then touch on two issues that Blake touched on and go in a little bit more detail. And those are trade and the Farm Bill. And then I'd like to just finish by making a couple of observations about what's going on in Washington and why do we have the partisanship that we have and what do we think can be done about it. Let's first start with the political situation, and as you can see here from this slide, that the president's approval rating is now up to about 41%. Interesting, in the State of the Union address, there was a poll that came out right afterwards. 95% of the Republicans approved of it, 75% of the independents approved of it, and even 43% of the Democrats approved of it. So that tells you that I think he pretty much hit a home run on his State of the Union address. It's quite presidential. But this election that is coming up in November, the Democrats are clearly going to make this a referendum about Donald Trump and what he's done the first 2 years. And normally, the midterm election is not very good to the party that holds the White House. As you can see here, the House, the Republicans have a 23-seat advantage, and there are 23 Republicans in the House that are running in seats that Hillary Clinton won in 2016. There's probably now, that number's actually just changed again today. This was written yesterday, or there were 2 more that announced their retirement yesterday, so there's now 48 that are not seeking re-election, either running for higher office or retiring. And according to Charlie Cook, there's about 50 seats in the House that are deemed to be competitive. So right now, it is a real coin flip about who will control the House come January of 2019. Whether the Republicans will retain control or not, it's going to be very, very close. In the Senate, the Republicans now have a 1-seat advantage after they lost the Alabama seat. We all heard a lot about that. But look at the numbers. There are 26 Democrats up for re-election in 2018 and only 8 Republicans. And as you can see, there's several that are also not seeking re-election, 3 of them all on the Republican side, and there's about 11 competitive seats. I think the Republicans will retain control. I think Republicans will pick up some seats because of these vast numbers of Democrats running. But at one time, the Republicans were talking about getting to 60 votes, and I just think that's out of reach at this point. So let's turn to trade, and these are a few of the quotes that Donald Trump has made about trade during the campaign and after he got elected. Let's look at NAFTA first. Here's one of his tweets. "We are in the NAFTA, worst trade deal ever made. Renegotiation process with Mexico and Canada, both being very difficult, may have to terminate." He said that in August of 2017. On South Korea, he said, "So because of the fact that our trade deal is so bad for the United States and so good for South Korea, I said we'll focus on the military, but actually we're going to try to straighten it out and make a fair deal for everybody." That was said in September of 2017. Then on China, one of his favorite topics, he tweeted in November of last year, "I don't blame China. I blame the incompetence of past administrations for allowing China to take advantage of the U.S. on trade, leading up to a point where the U.S. is losing hundreds of billions of dollars. How can you blame China for taking advantage of people that had no clue? I would have done the same." So let's take a look at these comments and go into a little detail. And Blake talked about this a little bit as well, relative to ag trade. If you look at our top export markets for U.S. ag products last year, in 2016, Canada was number 1 at 20 billion. Right behind them was China at 19 billion and Mexico at 18 billion. So our top 3 export markets are all now right in the crosshairs of some very serious trade negotiations and trade deals. And as Blake alluded to, this administration, through Ambassador Bob Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, and some others in the White House have focused on trade deficits that we have with certain countries. And you look at NAFTA, you look at Korea, you look at China, these are all trade irritants at this point, and I'll talk about this in just a second. So let's first look at NAFTA. You can see NAFTA went into effect in 1994. In 1993, our ag exports to the NAFTA countries were $9 billion. By 2017, they had risen to $39 billion. I don't think anybody can say that NAFTA hasn't been anything other than a huge success for the agriculture industry. 30% of our total ag exports go to Canada and Mexico. They are critically important export markets for U.S. ag products. Canada alone, our top export items are prepared foods, fresh vegetables, fresh fruit, and snack foods. And for Mexico, it's corn, soybeans, pork, and dairy products. Now, you know, we've heard a lot about NAFTA. The President has threatened to terminate NAFTA. And I will just tell you, I think over the last couple of months, due to a lot of hard work, particularly by the agriculture community, I'm a lot less worried that we're going to drop out of NAFTA. I think the President's tough rhetoric is trying to negotiate a better deal, and there's clearly a better deal to be had. I think that what we're likely to end up with in the end is that NAFTA is going to take longer than people expected. Originally, they thought it'd get done, a renegotiation in March. I think now we're looking probably something closer to the end of the year. But in the end, I think we're going to end up modernizing NAFTA and not terminating NAFTA, which is great news for agriculture. And what do I mean by modernizing? I think they're going to add an energy chapter, which was not contemplated back in 1993. I think we're going to add a chapter on intellectual property. I think we're going to add a much greater chapter on phytosanitary and sanitary standards, which is critical for agriculture and the food industry. And I think they'll be able to claim victory. But in the end, I think we'll modernize, and I don't think we'll drop out of NAFTA, despite all the rhetoric. Korea. This is another huge market. It's our number 5 export market for agricultural products. The President has made no bones about the fact he thinks the agreement that we just recently entered into during the Obama administration with Korea was a very bad deal. It's a critically important market for our protein, for beef, for pork, for corn, and for fresh fruit. Again, I don't think we're going to drop out of the Korean agreement, even though he's threatened that. I think, again, these are negotiating tactics that the President likes to use. But I think he also understands how critically important these export markets are. And I think that he started a renegotiation, and I think those renegotiations will prove to be successful and we'll get increased market access for Korea. Finally, let me talk to you a little bit about China, because for me personally, as I view the landscape on our trade policy, I am more concerned about China right now than I actually am NAFTA. What do I mean by this? Well, let me set the stage. First of all, China is our #1 overall trading partner at the macro level. For agriculture, as I pointed out earlier, we did $19 billion. It's our #2 export market. Some years it's even #1. Our top exports to China are soybeans, corn, hides, and skins, and pork. Critically important market for us. And yet, the Chinese have had a tendency to steal our intellectual property, which has been a huge concern on the part of previous administration. It's clearly a challenge for this new administration. We've already seen the administration slap duties on washing machines and solar panels. And get ready, because I think we're going to see further action over the coming months on things like intellectual property, on steel and aluminum. And I think the Chinese have made it pretty clear, if we take those actions, that there will be retaliation. And agriculture stands right in the bullseye of any potential retaliation, given the enormous market it is for our products. So I think we should prepare ourselves that we may face some form of retaliation as the Trump administration ratchets up pressure on China for some of the protectionist trade policies that they have. Now, in the end, where do I think this is all going? Let me just summarize. One, I think on trade, I think we'll stay in NAFTA, we'll modernize it. It's going to take longer than we originally thought. And I want to give great credit to the agriculture industry. I know there's a lot of folks in this room that have worked very hard for us to stay in NAFTA. The Republican governors, Republican senators, Republican House members have been talking regularly to the White House, including the President, about the importance of modernizing but not dropping out of NAFTA. Number 2, I think that We'll renegotiate the Korean agreement, and I think that will be good for agriculture. Number three, I think China over the next few months is going to prove to be a challenge for us as the Trump administration takes further action, potentially against some of their trading practices. And then finally, I think something we need to get focused on is what is our positive longer-term trade agenda? What do I mean by that? The president talked about negotiating new trade agreements. We do not have one new free trade agreement being negotiated right now. Part of that is because we don't have a lot of the people in place. A lot of them have been held up. But having said that, I think it's time for us in agriculture to really push the administration to start negotiating new deals with Japan, with the European Union, with the United Kingdom, and with others, and possibly to join back in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because playing this defensive strategy is not a winning proposition long-term for agriculture. Let me flip to a second issue, and Blake briefly touched on this. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, and that's the upcoming Farm Bill. As you know, we reauthorize farm bills every 4 to 5 years. It is probably the most significant piece of legislation in terms of reauthorizing the programs that the Department of Agriculture has jurisdiction over. It's everything from farm programs to crop insurance to forestry to nutrition to conservation to trade. It's a huge undertaking to take on the Farm Bill every 4 or 5 years. As was talked about here a bit earlier, 3 out of the last 5 farm bills haven't been passed on time. So if you're just a betting person on the trends, you're in an election year, you're going to bet this probably isn't going to get done this year, because in the congressional calendar, by the time they get to the end of July and they break for the August recess, nothing will get done legislatively until after the election in November. So they've got a tall order to get this bill done between now and the end of July. You know, this will be my 8th farm bill. My first one when I was in the Reagan administration in 1981. And one of the things that I have observed is that the outcome of the Farm Bill is really determined by 3 drivers. The first is, what is the budget situation at the time the bill is written? Second is, what's the political situation at the time the bill is written? And then finally, what are some of the key policy considerations? So let me just take a minute and talk about each one of these. I love pie charts. So what I'm trying to do here is just lay out for you exactly how farm program versus conservation versus nutrition has changed, and how the overall cost of the farm bills have changed going back the last couple of farm bills. So if you look at this slide, in 2002, when we wrote that farm bill, the total cost, 5-year cost, was $241 billion. And you can see here nutrition, which was almost entirely the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, was 67% of it. Commodities, which is our farm programs for wheat, corn, cotton, rice, dairy, was 25%. You go to the 2008 Farm Bill, and you can see there that the cost had grown to $405 billion, and the slice of the pie that went to nutrition had gone to 78%, and farm programs had fallen to 8%. Now look at the 2014 Farm Bill, the one that we're living in under right now, and of which this spring will be the last crop year covered by it. You can see that the cost of the Farm Bill had risen to $478 billion over 5 years. So look, you go back to 2002, it was $241 billion, and nutrition was 67%, and commodities were 25%. Now look at 2014, double the price tag at $478 billion, and nutrition was 79% of the cost of the Farm Bill. Even under the most broadest definition of assistance to farmers, as Blake alluded to, only 20% of the Farm Bill spending is accounted for to programs that assist farmers, whether it's farm programs, conservation, trade, etc. So you can see here that nutrition is taking up a bigger slice of this. Why is this? Well, the SNAP program at its peak after the economic decline of 2007, 2008, the SNAP program peaked at $80 billion a year. We had basically 1 in 6 Americans on SNAP following the huge economic meltdown we had in 2007 and 2008. That number now has fallen from 80 billion down to about 71 billion, and we've gone from almost 50 million Americans on SNAP down to 41 million. But this gives you a sense of Farm Bill costs and how they're allocated. Make one other point. It's a misnomer to call this a Farm Bill. It really is. I mean, if we were following FDA, truthful and not misleading, this is not truthful and highly misleading. This is not a Farm Bill, it's a nutrition assistance bill that happens to have 20% of the price tag affiliated with something related to farm programs. So what's the politics? And this is going to go back to the SNAP piece, so don't forget what I just put up there about SNAP, because the politics fits into this. On the House side, I told you earlier, Republicans have a 23-seat advantage. How many rural districts do you think there are out of 435? 35. And what do I mean by that? That means 50% or more of the population is deemed to be rural. There are only 35 districts out of 435 that are primarily rural districts. Meanwhile, there's 195 districts that are deemed urban. And by urban, that means 95% or more of the population is urban. So I'm not the brightest person in the whole world, but if you have to get to 218 votes and you only have 35 rural districts, you got to figure out ways to get non-rural members to vote for a farm bill. And also another complicating factor, if you're Mike Conaway, the chairman of the House Ag Committee from Texas, who does a terrific job, is that you have 30 members, a couple from North Carolina, that are members of the so-called Freedom Caucus. Virtually every one of them will vote no on a farm bill. So you take off the fact that you've got only 35 rural districts and you have 30 members of the Freedom Caucus, most of which will vote no, and you only have a 23-seat advantage. That adds up to saying you're probably going to need 40 to 50 Democrats to vote for the bill to get to 218 votes to pass it. And that's exactly what Mike Conaway and Ranking Member Colin Peterson from Minnesota are trying to work on right now. That's also why SNAP will be in the Farm Bill, rather than last time when we went through this process where they tried to split it off. It will be in the Farm Bill, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. In the Senate, I already mentioned to you that there's 26 Democrats up for re-election and only 8 Republicans. Notice that of the 10 Democrats on the Ag Committee, 8 of them are up for re-election. And I actually think that's a good thing, because I think they're going to be in a position where they're going to want to be viewed as trying to work on a bipartisan basis, and they're going to want to try to deliver something for their rural and ag constituencies. And that includes Debbie Stabenow from Michigan, and Bob Casey from Pennsylvania, Sherrod Brown from Ohio. You've got the Indiana Senator Joe Donnelly up for re-election, Heidi Heitkamp from North Dakota. Those are all states Donald Trump won, and in some cases by big margins. So I think there's some motivation there to work together on a bipartisan basis with Pat Roberts and Debbie Stabenow to try to get a bill. And then finally, what are some of the key Farm Bill issues? Well, as Blake alluded to, and as you saw in the previous charts, these farm bills are expensive. According to the Congressional Budget Office, if you take the current farm program and extend it out for 10 years, which is called the baseline, the program will cost somewhere around $900 billion over 10 years. Now remember, 80% of that is SNAP, but nonetheless, it's about a $900 billion bill over 10 years. So there's going to be no new money. I think the good news is right now, they're not having to cut from the baseline. But the reality of it is there's no new money, and there is, by the way, no shortage of folks that are trotting up to the House and Senate Ag Committees every day asking to spend more money on a new program or an existing program. Number 2 is SNAP. Last time around the House of Representatives, we had a big fight over SNAP, whether SNAP should be in the Farm Bill or separated. They tried to separate it, and it was a disaster. They couldn't pass the bill on the floor. It was defeated on the House floor. It was an embarrassment for all of us. This time around, I think SNAP will be in the Farm Bill, but there'll be debates on two issues, and let me outline what they are. Number one is work requirements. What do I mean by that? You've already seen on Medicaid that certain states now are seeking waivers that said able-bodied males, ages 19 to 54, either have to, and that are seeking Medicaid assistance, would either have to be in a job, in job training, or do volunteer work 80 hours a month, 80 hours a month. And you have to do one of those three things in order to stay eligible for Medicaid. That same approach is being talked about under SNAP for able-bodied males. Again, these are 19 to 54 that are deemed to be physically able, and they'd have to have some kind of work, job training, or volunteer activity in order to stay eligible for SNAP. That'll be a huge fight. Second of all, there's going to be a fight over whether or not the government should limit what a SNAP recipient can use their EBT card, their electronic benefit transfer card, their so-called SNAP card, and what they can purchase in a grocery store. As you know or may know today, you can't purchase alcohol or tobacco, but you can buy any other product, any other food product. There is a whole group out there, the left-right coalition, that has come together to try to look at this issue. And there is an effort to try to limit SNAP choice. And by that means saying you can't buy sweetened beverages, you can't buy snack foods, you can't buy candy, and you can't buy dessert. We're going to have a very large debate over that. Now, by the way, that proposal does not save any money. And in fact, if you're a retailer, you don't like this because you're going to be the point of enforcement where you're going to have to enforce that program for no benefit. So we're going to have a big fight over that. In the end, I don't think it will happen, but it will be a big fight on the House and Senate floors. As Blake alluded to, we also are going to have a debate over commodity programs. We have a dairy program that has proven in the last Farm Bill. It's called the Margin Protection Program. It's basically a risk management program where you can buy insurance between the difference of the average milk price and your average feed cost, called a margin, and you can buy different levels of coverage. Well, as it ended up, we've many years paid in more, dairy farmers have, than ever got out of the program, and it hasn't proven to be very effective, particularly for small and medium-sized producers. So there's going to be a major effort to rework that program to make it more attractive, particularly to small and medium-sized producers. Also, as Blake alluded to, we've had a tremendous problem with the cotton program. We had to rewrite the cotton program last time because of a cotton decision that came out of the World Trade Organization against our cotton program that was brought by the Brazilian industry. And they changed it from a Title I commodity program like wheat and corn, and they turned it into an insurance program. And to be very honest, it's been a disaster. It hasn't worked. Very few cotton producers have participated. And so what they're going to try to do is take that program and turn it back into the same kind of program we have for wheat and corn and rice. And I think they will do that. Crop insurance. Today we have about 280 million acres of federally subsidized crop insurance policies out in the United States. It's become really the pillar of our farm program, both for revenue insurance as well as for catastrophic losses on yields. It's critically important, as you can tell from the pie chart I put up there. We spend more now on crop insurance than we do on the commodity programs, and it's a pillar of our program. Having said that, there is this very odd coalition between the Heritage Action Foundation, I should say over here on the right, and the Environmental Working Group on the left. And they've put together this coalition to go after crop insurance. And what they want to do is to reduce the amount of crop insurance subsidies that are available for higher income producers. The problem with that is if you start taking out higher income producers from the crop insurance program, then you're spreading that risk over a smaller pool, and it's going to raise premiums for others. So we're going to have a very big fight on that. That could be one of the biggest fights in the Farm Bill, both on the House and Senate floor, will be on trying to protect federal crop insurance. Finally, something that's near and dear to my heart, as I know it is the commissioners, and that's research. You know, you look at research here in the United States, and our premier research institution, National Institute of Health, spends $34 billion a year on research. The National Science Foundation spends $7 billion a year. At USDA, we spend about $2.8 billion a year on research. It's a little known fact that the National Institute of Health spends more money on agriculture and food-related research than the entire USDA ag research budget. The entire ag research budget, NIH does. So when you go around and you talk to land-grant universities like North Carolina State, Purdue, University of California system at Davis, Florida, elsewhere, and you talk to the researchers, and I think people here at the land-grant university here in Raleigh would tell you this, that when their researchers go after grant money, they go after NIH, NSF, Department of Energy, NASA, and USDA is way down the list. And a lot of that is because only about 12 or 13% of USDA's budget on research is competitively awarded peer-reviewed research. Whereas at the National Institute of Health and the National Science Foundation and many of the other research, government research agencies, 90+% is competitively awarded. So this time around, I'm happy to report Congress is taking a very close look at research. There's going to be a major effort to try to enhance it, to make it more competitive, and to ensure that more of the ag research that occurs is done funded through USDA versus other institutions. Finally, let me just close by talking about something that all of us that work in Washington have to deal with every single day. And I got to tell you, I've been working there a long time, and it is frustrating, and that is the growing partisanship that exists in Washington. And it's very easy to blame your member of Congress, and I do the same. But the reality of it is when you step back and you look at it, I really believe that individual members of Congress and members of the Senate may be the effect, the partisanship, but I don't think they're really the cause. And what do I mean by that? Let me cite 4 or 5 factors that I think better explain the position I'm trying to outline. First of all, as I said earlier, we have this huge rural-urban divide. You look at a map of the United States, blue versus red, the entire middle of the country is red. The coasts are blue. And the middle part of the country, we just talked about, we've got 34 or 35 districts in the House of Representatives that are rural. And we've got 195 that are urban. And virtually all those rural districts, say 1 or 2, are represented by Republicans. And a high percentage of those in the urban areas are represented by Democrats. There's a huge rural-urban divide. Then there's the demographic problem that we have in this country. Demographic just meaning the partisanship that has occurred according to demographics. And what do I mean by that? You look at African Americans, they vote about 90% Democrat. Hispanic, about 67% Democrat. Asian Americans, about 79% Democrat. And then you look at Caucasians, 58% Republicans. And that last bullet I cited is very worrisome if you are a Republican running for president, and here's why. The last election, about 72% of all those voting were Caucasian. And every election, that presidential election, that falls by 2%. And when you have a Hispanic population that over the next 40 years is going to double from 17% to about 34%, and they're voting 2 out of every 3 Democratic, that is a huge, huge problem for Republicans as we move forward. But clearly the demographics are driving some of this partisanship. Then also redistricting. In 1997, there were about 164 of the 435 seats in the House of Representatives that were deemed to be competitive. In 2016, when Donald Trump ran for president, there were only about 72 competitive districts. And as I put up on the chart here, Charlie Cook and others are saying in the House there's about 50 competitive districts. And that's all because of redistricting. Every time we do a census every 10 years, the next one will be in 2020, whoever controls that process is going to draw the lines, and you guys know, given what's going on here in North Carolina, and the process that's going on there, and it tends to be kind of an incumbent protection program, and it limits the number of competitive seats. And then finally, and I find these statistics astounding, and that is on socioeconomics. I'm going to give you a couple of statistics on the number of counties in this country where one party or the other won 80% or more of the vote. 80% or more of the vote. In 1992, when Bill Clinton ran for president, there were 3 counties where one party or the other got 80% or more of the vote. In 2000, when George W. Bush was elected president, there were 81 counties that got 80% of the vote or more. When Donald Trump got elected, now remember, there's about 3,000 counties in the country. 388 counties voted 80% or more for one party. So that clearly shows you that we have a growing partisanship with over 10% of the counties voting for one party or the other by 80%. Finally, let me just close by another factor. And there is a political scientist at Stanford University called Mo Fiorina, who has coined a phrase, the ping pong effect. And some of you may have seen a piece he had in the Wall Street Journal about 3 or 4 Saturdays ago. I really liked it. And one of the statistics he put up is that in the last 9 elections, not just presidential election, but every 2 years, whether presidential or midterm, at least the White House, the House, or the Senate, 7 out of 9 of those elections, at least one of those bodies flipped. And he started to look at this and he wanted to know why. And here are some of the factors that he found to be the cause. Number one, the Republican Party is becoming far more conservative. The Democratic Party is becoming far more progressive. And when you go out and poll Americans about which party they belong to, the growing party, so to speak, are independents. If you ask them, the ones that feel that they're unaffiliated, that middle box there are those that are deeming themselves to be independent, and that is a growing number of Americans. It's also interesting to point out that the money behind each of the parties, in the case of Republicans, that tends to be even more conservative than the party itself, and on the Democratic side, it tends to be more liberal or progressive than the party itself. So even that the financing apparatuses are pulling the parties even further to the right in the case of Republicans or the left in the case of the Democrats. So in the end, I think all of these factors are leading to more partisanship. We're all frustrated by it. But I guess my message is to you, until we have another census and until we have another redistricting and see who controls the governorships and the state legislatures, my forecast would be we better get used to it, because I think we're going to see a lot more of this, because more and more voters are less identifying with the major parties and are identifying themselves as independents, and they tend to swing election by election. Commissioner, with that, I'll stop. Be glad to take any questions. Thank you.